What would you do if everything you had ever worked for, everything you'd sacrificed for, just disappeared? What if you had nowhere left to go, and two little faces looking up at you asking where you were going to sleep? That's the question Sarah Mitchell asked herself at 2 a.m. on a cold October night in the Greyhound station in Columbus, Ohio. She sat on a wooden bench, her two children curled against her sides. Marcus, age 7, and little Emma, just 4 years old. Marcus's head was tucked under her chin. Emma had her thumb in her mouth, something she only did when she was stressed or scared. Sarah's thin cardigan wasn't nearly enough for the chill seeping through the station's old windows. Sarah had worked her entire adult life to be somebody, to be the kind of mother who could give her kids stability, a real home, a future. She'd started as a cashier at a grocery store when she was 19, fresh out of high school and newly pregnant with Marcus. The father had taken off before Marcus was even born, and Sarah promised herself that her son would never feel abandoned, never wonder if he was enough. So she worked. She worked doubles, she worked weekends, she worked herself to exhaustion. When Emma came along 3 years later, a beautiful surprise during a brief relationship that also didn't last, Sarah just worked harder. But then came the day that changed everything. 3 months ago, her boss called her into the office. The store was closing. The entire location was shutting down. Economic factors, he'd said, not meeting profit margins, corporate decisions. Sarah had felt her world tilt. She'd been there for 12 years. She was the assistant manager. She knew every regular, every supplier, every inch of that store. And suddenly, she was obsolete. The severance they gave her barely covered 2 months of rent on the tiny apartment she rented on the south side. She'd applied to every store, every restaurant, every business that would take her application. But 12 years at one place meant she didn't have experience on paper at other places. And she was competing against people with formal credentials, younger people without gaps on their resumes from being sick with Marcus when he had pneumonia, or staying home when Emma had the flu. 6 weeks ago, she'd gotten an eviction notice. 30 days to pay or leave. She'd tried everything. She'd called her sister in Cleveland, but her sister's husband didn't have room for them, and Sarah could hear the worry in her voice. She'd looked into assistance programs, but they all had waiting lists or requirements she didn't quite meet. She'd swallowed her pride and asked her church for help, but they'd given her $100 and the name of a shelter 2 towns over. That's when Sarah realized she couldn't afford to stay. The shelter was full. Another shelter wanted references she didn't have. Friends' couches were temporary fixes that lasted days, not weeks. The Greyhound ticket to nowhere seemed like her only option. Maybe in another city, things would be different. Maybe she'd find work, find a place, find a way forward. But that was naive thinking. That was the thinking of someone broken enough to believe that suffering could be geographically relocated. The last friend she'd stayed with, a woman named Jennifer who worked at a diner, had let them stay for 4 nights. On the 5th morning, Jennifer's boyfriend told Sarah it was time to go. Sarah didn't fight it. She couldn't afford to be a burden. So she'd taken Marcus and Emma, packed a suitcase, and bought 3 tickets to Cincinnati on the Greyhound. She'd chosen Cincinnati randomly, just pointing at a name on the board, as if it mattered where they went. They'd been riding for 6 hours when Sarah realized her plan was even worse than the reality she was running from. Now, sitting in the terminal with her children, Sarah felt something inside her crack. She'd always been strong. She'd always been the one holding it together. But at 2 in the morning, on a bench surrounded by sleeping transients and the hum of fluorescent lights, with her children's small bodies warm against her sides, Sarah allowed herself to feel the full weight of her failure. She was 34 years old, and she had become homeless. She looked down at Marcus, sleeping soundly, his little hand clutching her sleeve. He was so smart, so full of questions about the world. He wanted to be a scientist. Emma wanted to be a veterinarian. Both of them had dreams so bright and hopeful that Sarah's heart cracked every time she thought about the reality they were waking up to. The station was nearly empty at this hour. A few people slumped in chairs, traveling nobodies moving from one nowhere to another. An old man with a shopping cart full of cans. A group of teenagers roughhousing near the ticket counter. Sarah pulled Marcus and Emma closer, her protective instinct kicking into overdrive. She'd heard stories about bus stations, about dangerous people and unsafe nights. She stayed awake, watching, waiting for morning, praying for sunrise. Around 4 in the morning, a man walked into the station. Sarah didn't notice him at first. She was dozing fitfully, her mind too exhausted to stay alert. But then she heard his footsteps. Not the shuffling of tired travelers or the clicking of security shoes, but the confident stride of someone who belonged, someone who wasn't there by accident. He was tall, probably in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and clothes that spoke of money, a tailored charcoal coat, expensive loafers, a leather bag that looked like it cost more than Sarah made in a month. He was pulling an overnight bag behind him, and he moved through the station like he was walking through a private club, not a Greyhound terminal at 4 in the morning. Sarah looked away quickly. People like that didn't notice people like her. The wealthy had a skill for not seeing the struggling. It was almost a superpower. The man got coffee from the vending machine, sat down 3 rows behind Sarah, and opened his laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated his face. He looked tired, but purposeful. The kind of tired that came from late-night business deals, not the soul-deep exhaustion of survival. Sarah thought nothing of him. Why would she? He was just another person passing through, moving on to bigger and better places. She turned her attention back to her children, back to the weight of her impossible situation, back to the question she'd been asking herself since the eviction notice. How was she going to do this? How was she going to survive? And then Emma woke up. She didn't cry. Emma was a quiet child, anxious and introspective even at 4. She just opened her eyes and looked at her mother with confusion and sadness. "Mommy, where are we?" Emma's voice was small, fragile as glass. "Shh, baby, we're at the bus station." "Go back to sleep," Sarah whispered, pulling her daughter closer. "Why are we at the bus station, Mommy?" "I don't like it here. It smells funny and it's cold." Emma started to cry, softly. Her little shoulders shaking, Sarah felt her own eyes sting with tears. She held Emma and rocked her gently, singing the lullaby she'd sung to both her children since they were born. The same one her mother had sung to her all those years ago, before life got hard, before everything fell apart. And that's when the man looked up. He stared for a long moment. Sarah felt his gaze like a physical touch. She wanted to tell him to look away, to mind his own business, to not judge her for being a mother who couldn't provide. But she didn't have the energy to defend herself anymore. The man closed his laptop. He stood up, and he started walking toward them. Sarah's heart began to race. She pulled Emma closer, her protective instincts suddenly roaring to life. She didn't know this man. She didn't know what he wanted. In this moment, in this terrible moment when she was vulnerable and scared, every instinct told her to be afraid. He stopped a few feet away. He didn't smile. He just looked at Sarah with eyes that held something she hadn't seen in so long, she almost didn't recognize it. Compassion. Real, genuine, unstudied compassion. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said quietly, his voice deep and measured. "But I have to ask, are you 3 okay?" Sarah's throat tightened. No one had asked her that in months. No one had seen her well enough to ask. "We're fine," she lied automatically. "Just traveling." The man's eyes moved to Emma, who was still crying silently. Then to Marcus, who had woken up and was watching the stranger with the wariness of a child who'd learned early not to trust. "It's 4 in the morning, the man said gently. "And you're sleeping on a bus station bench. That's not traveling. That's survival." Sarah felt something break inside her. The dam she'd been holding up finally gave way, and tears spilled down her face. She turned away, ashamed, trying to shield her children from seeing their mother fall apart. The man didn't leave. He sat down across from them, at a respectful distance, and just waited. "My name is David Hartwell," he said quietly. "And I think maybe I'm supposed to be here right now. I think maybe this is exactly where I'm supposed to be." Sarah looked at him through her tears. This stranger who'd materialized out of the darkness with his expensive coat and his kind eyes and his certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. She wanted to tell him to go away. She wanted to tell him she didn't need his pity. She wanted to say so many things. Instead, she heard herself whisper, "I don't have anywhere to go." And that's when everything changed. That's when a woman who'd been falling finally felt someone reach out their hand. But Sarah didn't know it yet. She didn't know that this moment, this terrible, vulnerable moment sitting on a bench in a bus station at 4 in the morning, was going to transform her entire life. She just knew that a stranger was looking at her children with kindness, and for the first time in months, she didn't feel completely alone. The sun was beginning to rise outside the station windows, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. And Sarah Mitchell, who'd been running toward the future with no idea where she was going, finally felt like she might have found her way to solid ground. David Hartwell didn't ask a lot of questions that first morning. He just listened. Sarah found herself telling him things she hadn't told anyone. The loss of her job, the failed relationships, the eviction notice, the desperate Greyhound ticket to nowhere. She told him about Marcus's dreams of science and Emma's love of animals. She told him about the shame of failure, the crushing weight of not being enough, the fear that kept her awake at night, wondering if her children would remember her as the mother who tried or the mother who broke. "I had it all figured out," she said, her voice hollow. "I was going to be different. I wasn't going to be like my mother, moving from man to man, depending on someone else. I was going to make it on my own. I was going to give my kids a real life." David listened. Really listened. The way people rarely do. His face was attentive but not judgmental. Sad but not pitying. "The thing about plans," he said finally, "is that they're just stories we tell ourselves about how things should go. And life rarely follows the script. That doesn't mean you failed. It means you're human." Emma had fallen asleep against Sarah's side, her small head tilted back, her mouth slightly open. Marcus was eating a donut David had bought from a nearby convenience store, watching the stranger with cautious curiosity. "I can help you," David said quietly. "I have a proposal if you're open to hearing it." Sarah's instinct was to say no. She'd learned not to accept things from strangers. There was always a price. There was always an angle. But she also had nowhere to go and 2 children who needed more than good intentions. "What kind of help?" she asked carefully. David explained that he owned a small hotel in Akron, about an hour north of Columbus. He needed someone to manage the front desk and help with general operations. The pay was modest, $38,000 a year, which sounded like a fortune to Sarah. But more importantly, there was an apartment above the hotel. It came with the job. "Free rent, utilities included. I'm looking for someone reliable," David said. "Someone who has genuine reasons to show up and do good work. Someone who won't steal from me or disappear after 2 weeks. Someone who understands what it means to have responsibilities." Sarah's first instinct was to ask why. Why would he do this? Why would a wealthy man give jobs to homeless women? But then she realized the answer didn't matter. What mattered was that her children wouldn't sleep in a bus station tonight. "I want to work," Sarah said. "I'm not asking for charity." "I know," David smiled for the first time. "That's why I think you'll be perfect." They drove north in David's car, a luxury sedan that smelled like leather and intelligence. Marcus pressed his face against the window, watching the Ohio landscape unfold. Emma clutched a stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was born, finally peaceful in a way she hadn't been since they'd started running. The hotel was a small, well-maintained 3-story building on the outskirts of Akron. The sign out front was a little worn but respectable. The Riverside Inn. It was near a highway exit, the kind of place that attracted business travelers and families on road trips. "Not fancy," David acknowledged, "but steady. We get about 60% occupancy year-round. Good repeat customers. The night clerk just left last month, so the front desk is understaffed." He showed them the apartment, 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a living room with a window that looked out over a parking lot, and, beyond that, a strip of trees that marked the beginning of a nature preserve. It was humble compared to the apartment Sarah used to rent, but it was theirs. There was space. There was light. There was hope. Sarah moved them in that very day. David gave her sheets and towels from the hotel's supply closet, along with some basic groceries from a local store. By evening, the kids were in beds of their own, and Sarah sat on the kitchen floor and cried, not from despair this time, but from gratitude so overwhelming she could barely breathe. That night, she looked at her children sleeping peacefully and made herself a promise. She would never take this opportunity for granted. She would work harder than she'd ever worked. She would be the best employee David had ever had. She would prove that his kindness hadn't been wasted. The next morning, Sarah started her new job. At first, it was just front desk work, checking guests in, answering phones, processing credit cards. It was familiar work, the kind of work she'd done for years. She fell into it easily, her professional skills intact even if her confidence had been shattered. But David didn't stop there. Within the first week, he started showing her other aspects of the hotel business. He taught her how to manage inventory, how to handle supplier relationships, how to read the booking system, and predict slow periods. He showed her the books, not in detail, but enough to understand the business model, the profit margins, the real economics of running a place like this. "Why are you teaching me all this?" Sarah asked one afternoon, sitting in David's office while the front desk was quiet. "Because I think you could do my job," he said simply. And because I think you need to understand that you're capable of more than just survival. You're capable of excellence." Over the weeks that followed, Sarah began to believe him. She started to remember who she was before everything fell apart. She was smart. She was capable. She was good at this. The guests noticed too. They remembered her. They asked for her specifically. One regular businessman started making a point of arriving on the days Sarah worked the front desk. An older couple even asked if she managed the hotel, because surely someone this competent must be in charge. Marcus started school at a public elementary school 2 miles away. Sarah drove him every morning, and he talked about his science classes, about an experiment he was doing with pH and batteries, about a teacher who thought he had real potential. Emma started pre-K, and she came home singing. Songs about animals and friendship. Their lives began to have rhythm, routine, the kind of predictability that children thrive on and that Sarah had almost forgotten existed. 2 months into the job, Sarah had her first real paycheck. After taxes and deductions, it was $1,800 for 2 weeks of work. She held that check in her hands for 10 minutes, just staring at it. She'd made more than this in 2-week periods before, but that money had never felt this real, this earned, this transformative. She immediately opened a savings account and put half the check in it. The other half went to buy Marcus new sneakers, his were falling apart, and to replace the worn-out clothes in Emma's closet. She filled the refrigerator with fresh fruit and vegetables. She paid for a haircut for herself, something she hadn't done since before the eviction notice. Looking at herself in the mirror with her freshly cut hair, Sarah barely recognized the woman looking back. But she liked her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she actually liked herself. David noticed the change. One afternoon, as Sarah was leaving work, he stopped her. "You know," he said, "I didn't hire you just to check people into rooms." "I know," Sarah said. "And I appreciate everything you've done. I really do. I'm trying to—" "No," David interrupted gently. "I mean, I have bigger plans. I'm thinking about opening a second location in Cleveland, and I want someone to help me run it. Someone I trust. Someone I believe in." He paused. "I want you to become the assistant general manager of the entire company. We'll need to get you some formal training, maybe some community college courses in hospitality management, but I think you could do it. I think you could be incredible at it." Sarah felt her knees weaken. "Assistant general manager, her? I can't," she said automatically. "I don't have the education. I don't have—" "You have the thing that matters most," David said firmly. "You have integrity. You have the hunger to prove yourself. You have skin in the game because you know what it's like to fail. That matters more than a degree. Will you think about it?" Sarah said yes before her fear could catch up with her. The next few months became a time of transformation that Sarah couldn't have imagined. She enrolled in night classes at Akron University, a hospitality management certificate program. She spent her days working at the Riverside Inn and her evenings in classrooms learning about operations management, customer service, financial management, and human resources. It was exhausting. She often fell asleep reading textbooks. But it was also the most alive she'd ever felt. Her mind was engaged. Her future was becoming something more than just survival, Marcus noticed. "Mom, you're different," he said one night as she was preparing for an exam. "You smile more now." Emma brought her drawings from school, elaborate pictures of animals and sunshine and happiness. "This is you being strong," Emma told her, pointing to a figure that was clearly meant to be Sarah. 4 months after that first morning in the bus station, David called Sarah into his office with a different kind of news. "I have someone I want you to meet," he said, and there was something strange in his voice, something almost nervous. "He's coming to visit the hotel tomorrow. His name is James. He's my son." Sarah froze. David had never mentioned having children. She realized suddenly how little she knew about this man who had completely transformed her life. "I thought you should know," David continued, "because James is going to be involved in the business decisions going forward. And because I think—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think there's going to be significant changes happening. And I want you to be ready." "What kind of changes?" Sarah asked, though something in her gut was already telling her that the next chapter was about to begin. David smiled mysteriously. "You'll see tomorrow. But Sarah, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me that no matter what happens next, you'll remember this. You saved yourself. I was just the catalyst. The strength, the determination, the willingness to keep going. That was all you. Sarah wanted to protest, to say that wasn't true, that she would never have survived without his help. But David held up his hand. "Promise me," he repeated. "I promise," Sarah whispered. The next morning, as she was preparing for her shift, Sarah looked at herself in the mirror again. She wore professional clothes now, a blazer and slacks that she'd bought with her own money. Her hair was maintained. Her nails were clean. She looked like someone who had her life together. She looked like someone with a future. And then the door to her apartment opened, and David stepped through with a young man in tow, tall, with his father's features and eyes that seemed to hold a familiar kind of sadness. "Sarah," David said, "I'd like you to meet James. And James, this is Sarah Mitchell. She's about to change your life as much as she's changed mine." As Sarah shook hands with David's son, she had no idea what was coming next. She had no idea that the real story was just beginning. All she knew was that David had given her a hand when she was falling, and somehow, impossibly, she'd managed to catch hold of something solid. James Hartwell didn't look like someone who needed his life to be changed. He looked like someone who had everything: the tailored suit, the expensive watch, the air of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. But Sarah could see something deeper in his eyes. She could see the same emptiness she'd felt in herself during those dark months in the bus station. She didn't ask questions, but David, it turned out, had plenty to share. Over coffee that morning, while James was upstairs settling into one of the hotel's rooms, David told Sarah about his son. James was 32 years old, Harvard-educated, a successful venture capitalist in New York. He had money, status, and every external marker of success. But he was also alone in a way that had nothing to do with relationships and everything to do with purpose. "He's been chasing something his whole life," David said quietly. "Something he thinks is out there if he just works hard enough, but it's not out there. It's inside. And I think he's finally starting to understand that." "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. "Because I think you two have something in common," David said. "You both thought that having things, a home, security, success, would make everything okay. But what really matters is having people, having purpose, having something to pour yourself into that's bigger than yourself." He paused. "And because I think James needs to hear your story," Sarah wanted to protest. Her story wasn't inspirational. It was cautionary. It was the story of someone who failed, who couldn't provide, who had to be rescued by a stranger. But David was already standing up, already heading to get his son. James listened to Sarah's story with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look away. He didn't offer empty platitudes or business-speak solutions. He just listened, the same way his father had. And when Sarah finished, he was quiet for a long time. "I've spent my entire life building," he said finally. "I've built investment portfolios, successful companies, a reputation. And I just realized last month that I don't actually have anything." He looked at Sarah, and his eyes were shining. "You lost your apartment, your job, almost everything. And you still had purpose. You still knew why you were fighting. I'm 42 and I don't even know that." Over the next few days, James stayed at the hotel. He watched Sarah work. He observed how she interacted with guests, how she anticipated problems before they arose, how she treated the housekeeping staff and the maintenance workers with genuine respect. He ate lunch with her and her children. He listened to Marcus talk about his science project. He watched Emma draw pictures, and slowly, something shifted in him. On his last night before returning to New York, James asked Sarah to sit down with him and his father in David's office. "I'm stepping back from the venture capital firm," James announced. "Effective immediately. And I want to partner with my father on the hotel business. Not because I think it's a lucrative investment, though I do, but because I think there's something real here, something meaningful, a place where lives actually get transformed." David looked surprised, then quietly proud. "There's something else," James continued, looking directly at Sarah. "I want to invest in a training program, a formal program with certification and everything that specifically helps people in your situation. People who have experienced homelessness, people who are climbing out of poverty, give them real job skills and placement services. We could start it here at the hotel, run it through the Cleveland location, eventually expand it." Sarah stared at him. "Why would you do that?" "Because my father helped you," James said simply. "Not with money or pity, but with belief. He believed you could be better than your circumstances. And look at you. Look at what you've become in just 4 months. Imagine what you could do with a program built specifically to help people like you. What happened next happened quickly. James brought in business consultants. He worked with the state to develop certification programs. He funded scholarships for people in transition, and he asked Sarah to lead the entire initiative. You? Sarah said when he first proposed it. You want me to run a program I've never done before? I want you to lead it, James corrected. With support, with training, with resources? Yes, because you understand the people it's designed to help. You are the people it's designed to help. Within 6 months, the Riverside Hotel training program was officially launched. Sarah worked with the state to establish curriculum standards. She hired teachers, established partnerships with local businesses, created mentorship opportunities. She was no longer just a front desk clerk. She was a program director. She had business cards that said so. She had a salary that reflected the work. She had purpose that extended far beyond just taking care of her own children. Marcus, now 8 years old, understood what was happening. He started volunteering as a junior assistant, helping program participants with their applications and paperwork. He would sit at his mother's desk during homework time, watching her work, observing how she moved through the world with confidence and intention. You're like a superhero, he told her one day. You save people. Sarah had tears in her eyes when she hugged him. The first cohort of the training program graduated on a spring morning when the Ohio weather had finally turned warm. 23 people stood in front of the hotel, wearing the modest certificates that represented their transformation. There were mothers like Sarah had been. There were young men who'd fallen through the cracks of the system. There were older workers trying to rebuild after loss. And all of them had made it. One of them, a woman named Keisha, hugged Sarah fiercely. I had a moment yesterday, Keisha said, tears streaming down her face. I was on my way to a job interview that this program helped me get. And I realized I was going to be okay. Not maybe okay, actually okay. And I knew it was because someone believed in me. Someone like you. Someone who understood. Sarah held her and thought about the moment in the bus station when she'd thought everything was over. She thought about how a stranger had seen her at her lowest, and instead of looking away, had looked deeper. But the real transformation came when David called a family meeting. It was a Friday evening. James was there, having moved to Ohio permanently. Marcus and Emma were there, sitting at a table covered with documents. David had a lawyer on video call. I'm changing my will, David announced without preamble. And I'm also changing the structure of the company. James will be the primary shareholder and CEO of Riverside Hotel Group. But Sarah, you're going to be vice president of development. And in the event that anything happens to me, this company becomes a trust that is run by the three of us. James, myself, and you. Sarah couldn't speak. She opened her mouth several times and nothing came out. You're family now, David said simply. Not because I rescued you, because you've changed everything. You've reminded me why I started this business in the first place. Not to make money, but to create something that matters. James leaned forward. We want to expand the program to 5 more cities. We want to create housing initiatives. We want to build something that can help thousands of people. And we want you leading it. That night, after Marcus and Emma were asleep, Sarah sat in her apartment, that she technically owned as part of her employment package, and looked at the contract James had printed out for her. Vice president, equity in the company, a salary that had just doubled, benefits that included college savings accounts for her children, security, stability, a future. But what made her cry weren't the numbers. It was the handwritten note at the bottom of the contract, in David's careful script. Sarah, from the moment I saw you and your children on that bench, I knew you were someone extraordinary. You just needed someone to believe in you. Now believe in yourself. You deserve everything that's coming. Welcome home, David. The next morning, Sarah made the decision that would define the next phase of her life. She called a meeting with James and David and laid out her vision. She wanted to do more than train people. She wanted to provide childcare support for low-income parents in the program. She wanted to partner with schools to identify at-risk children and provide mentorship. She wanted to address not just the symptoms of poverty, but the systems that created it. You're thinking too big, James said. Then he smiled. I like it. Let's do it. By the end of that year, Sarah had implemented the first phase of what would eventually become the Hartwell Foundation for Economic Opportunity. They provided scholarships for the children of program participants. They started a mentorship program that paired successful business people with people climbing out of poverty. They created a subsidized childcare facility specifically for program families. Marcus started talking about social entrepreneurship as a possible career path. Emma decided she wanted to be a veterinarian who ran an animal shelter. Both of them had seen their mother transform impossible circumstances into meaningful work, and they understood early what many people never learn, that you can be both of necessity and agent of change. 2 years after that first morning in the bus station, Sarah received an email that made her stop working and just stare at her computer screen for 20 minutes. It was from Ohio State University's main campus. They were offering her a full scholarship to complete a bachelor's degree in business administration and nonprofit management. Moreover, they'd created a scholarship in her name, the Sarah Mitchell Scholarship for Non-Traditional Students with Financial Constraints, $250,000 to help people like her get educated. The program director, a professor named Dr. Williams, had written, "Ms. Mitchell, your work has changed our understanding of what's possible in community development. We would be honored to have you as a student in our program. Your story matters. Your voice matters. Please come learn with us." Sarah walked into the hallway of the hotel and found David standing there, almost as if he'd been waiting. "Did you see the email?" he asked, and she realized he'd known. Of course he'd known. He probably helped make it happen. "Why do you keep doing this?" Sarah asked. "Why do you keep giving me these impossible opportunities?" David smiled. "Because someone has to show people what they're actually capable of. Most of the world is content to believe they're less than they are, but I looked at you that night in the bus station and I didn't see a failure. I saw a woman who would do absolutely anything for her children, who would endure discomfort, shame, fear, desperation, all for them. And I thought, imagine what she could do if she believed in herself the way she believes in them. But I wouldn't have done any of this without you," Sarah said. "You're right," David agreed, "but you also would have survived without me. You might have suffered more, it might have taken longer, but you have the strength inside you to survive anything. I just accelerated the timeline. I just said, what if we skip the struggle and go straight to the triumph?" Sarah started at Ohio State the following fall. She attended classes during the day and worked in the evenings. She studied while her children slept. She became the first person in her family to pursue a 4-year university degree. And gradually, over 3 years of classes and studying and growth, she transformed again. But this time, the transformation wasn't about survival. It was about becoming. On the day Sarah graduated from Ohio State University, she walked across the stage in her cap and gown, and the auditorium erupted. David was there, beaming. James was there, recording everything. Marcus and Emma were there, with signs that said, "My mom is the best," written in glitter. As Sarah held her diploma, she thought about the night everything changed. She thought about the woman she'd been. The woman who'd been so broken that she'd gotten on a bus with no destination, thinking that running away was the same as moving forward. She thought about what it meant to be seen, truly seen by another human being, not as a problem to be solved or a charity case to be pitied, but as a person with untapped potential. That evening, there was a celebration. David had closed down a restaurant for the night. There was food and champagne and laughter. The program participants she'd trained over the years came to celebrate her. Teachers from the training program came. Some of the guests who'd witnessed her transformation at the hotel came. It was a room full of people whose lives she'd touched because someone had reached out their hand when she was falling. Late in the evening, as things were winding down, David pulled Sarah aside. "I have to tell you something," he said, and his voice was different, older somehow, heavier. "I wasn't in that bus station by accident. I was driving back to Columbus from a board meeting, and there was an accident on the highway. I was stuck for hours. By the time I got around it, I missed my connection at the hotel. I ended up going to the bus station because I needed a coffee and I couldn't sleep. I almost went home instead. Almost decided to wait there for my driver. But something made me go inside. Some instinct I didn't understand." Sarah felt her chest tighten. "David, I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are also the moments when we're exactly where we need to be. When someone or something reaches out to catch us. I believe that, Sarah. I believe I